work with men, would you see the kind of biggest struggles when it comes to kind of self-expression show up for them?
Yeah, well, one thing that comes up for me is that we can chalk up the masculine and the feminine to often men feel unworthy and women feel too much. And I even noticed that in my own energetics, that the masculine in me and many men that I speak with feel like their voice doesn't count. And they may have been trained or programmed through their lives to believe that. And sometimes you have the overcompensation, the shadow aspects. And so men show up having wounds from their mothers, from their fathers, the institutions where they were raised. And it looks like suppressed emotions. It looks like suppressed expression. And often in those two areas, it could come out as being bully or being bullied, right? Passive. It can look as someone who is taking up too much space or not taking up enough space. And for me, this work is very much about harmony. How can we find the balance between the form, the structures of the masculine, that rational brain, and also the flow, that creativity, the graceful expression of our feminine, which often can be how we choose to put our energy out in the world, how we choose to be received by others. It's a beautiful journey once we become more aware of our own internal archetypes.
And then, like, even as you say that, like, some of that flies in the face of the kind of standard narrative we have about men. You know, I think there's so many narratives that get put on men. And I notice this so often, you know, especially in the age of social media, where you might come out and go, you know, men are struggling to express themselves, men are struggling to assert themselves, men are struggling for direction. But the kind of prevailing narrative is like, all men are powerful, all men do what they want and take what they want. And there's this kind of the experience we have as like people who work with men, and especially, you know, most of the men that probably come to the sort of work that we do are seeking to open their hearts and seeking to be better, compared to the narrative about men out in the world. And I often find it really kind of tricky line to walk, because I'm deeply passionate about serving men, but I'm also deeply passionate about like acknowledging the injustices and the things that men have done in the world, and the feminine experience and what women have gone through all the time. How do you find that merging of that gray area, that middle area, and those narratives?
Well, at Sacred Sons, we always say, all of you is welcome here. And the way that I view the masculine is that often men in these positions of power are behaving from their boy, from their inner child. They are maybe unconscious of their wounds and how they strive to destroy, corrupt, right, manipulate. And the way that I then have compassion for men like this is to speak to their little boy, for them to really receive where that origin, the root of their pain lies, and how to transmute that, alchemize it, bring it out into the light so that they can start to repattern that memory, for example. So yeah, I definitely see a trend in what you share, that civilization, that our society has probably had about enough of like the patriarchy of the toxic masculine. And then there's also this other side of the demasculated man. And there's a sweet spot in the middle where we're conscious leaders, we're really leaning into those roles of the masculine, call it the protector, the provider. And yet we have that emotional intelligence, that resonance to really feel the feminine, to uplift the feminine and be this cohesive team, or this intimacy that I have established more and more in myself, so that I can meet someone, my partner in this case, who can hold that with me and share the same vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I hear you say that, I imagine it's kind of men with these like immature parts of them, like immature masculine elements that they're carrying around, and it's running wild in their life, and it's created this world that we live in now. There's an advert by Barclays, you might have seen it, where it's like they start off with the adults, and then they basically show you how there's like little kids in every adult, and we're childish about money. So they're sitting in these like 10-year-olds sitting around a table arguing about, you know, who had the dessert and who had the starter. And I often think of that when I walk out into the world, or even when I read stories of like even horrible things, you're like, that's someone's like little boy reacting against the pain that he has and it coming out in this way. But because it's a grown man, the level of compassion we have for them is just so much lower in society. Like I feel sometimes that I think there's a general deficit of compassion, but I often feel for men, there's a real lack of compassion for them for good reason. But still, nonetheless, it does still kind of, I say, even hurts my heart to sometimes see and hear the things I hear said about men who have had no responsibility really in creating the world we're in.
Sure. And that's why for me, a superpower is authenticity. And with that comes honesty and vulnerability. How we find our strength in being witnessed in our full spectrum of humanness. I like to say the human being, the human is the identity, the flesh, all the kind of like spiky, sticky parts. And the being is our essence. It's our the kind of more subtle energetics that many tools that I work with, that Sacred Sons work with, can express and also like amplify those aspects of ourselves that really helps bring it into cohesion, coherenceness.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, I think of these essences of like play and joy and tussling of other people, like the things that we do as kids so naturally. Like I mentioned before, I've got a little boy, he's 7 months old, and he has this curiosity about everything, and he's like, trying to run and put everything in his mouth. And I see this curiosity and this aliveness and this joy for the smallest of things, like I've seen him look at a flower with like absolute wonder for minutes on end. And I often wonder, like, this has been kind of like lost out of us, and I'm kind of hearing what you're saying, that through some of the practices you practice with yourself and with Sacred Sons is like the aim is to bring this essence, these essential elements of man back into his day-to-day being so he can feed himself as that.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. We just had something called Prime Leadership out here in Portugal. It's a small intimate container for around 15 men over 4 days. And the main theme was connecting to our inner child. And I brought through a whole bunch of new ceremonies, tools, modalities, from a music production ceremony where men recorded their voices, maybe for the first time. And one of our facilitators created this like immense song that we all have as a memento. We had a podcast ceremony similar to what we're doing now. Each man expressed their passion, their purpose, their 15 minutes of fame. And then at the end, we had a portrait ceremony where we were captured in film, like analog, just our essence, maybe even leaning more into the feminine, how to feel comfortable having had all this masculine warrior, king, magician, lover energy, and then express it in this flowering, blossoming way in nature with this beautiful backdrop. So yes, play is key. Joy is like such a divine expression of who we are. And yet to be grounded in this, we have to acknowledge, accept, and integrate the human to really see those wounds as access points, as gateways. That's why I love Hermeticism and talk about it in the sense that your let, right, is the gold at the end of the rainbow. So what's heavy can become light, your light.